This episode of Trifles is brought to you by the Baker Street Journal, the leading publication of Sherlock Holmes scholarship since 1946. Find them online at bakerstreetirregulars.com. Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, Boscombe Valley was mysterious, Shoscombe Place was old, and the lodge was hysterical, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Was Holmes more of a tea drinker or a coffee fancier? And what are all of the alcoholic drinks mentioned in the stories?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 213, The Three Moriartys. Well, hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we talk about some of the details in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
And Burt, normally I am glad to see you every week here. I'm doubly glad to see you every 2 weeks on I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere. But today I am triply glad to see you.
Really? Are you Mo, Larry, or really glad?
Either way, we're all coming to you from Tripoli today. It's a fine island.
I wish I was back in Tripoli.
From the shores of Tripoli.
Well, you know, the last time I was on Tripoli, I tripped. Isn't that funny?
There should be a warning there on the beach when you get out.
There is, but it's in Italian. And when I was trying to read it, I got closer and fell over.
Well, you're very fragile, so we will take care. Well, this show is available at ihose.co/trifles213, all lowercase. That'll take you to our website, which is sherlockholmespodcast.com, and it'll take you directly to this episode where you can look at the show notes. You can leave a comment for us if you so wish. You can join through Patreon and become a member of our Discord community. However you decide to act once you get there, we welcome it. We absolutely love having our fans reach out. So thank you for being here. Now, let's get on with the show. Well, when we think about Moriarty, we usually think about him in the singular, with a Y at the end of his name. We don't think of him with the I-E-S, plural, Moriartys. Is that how you would pluralize Moriartys anyway?
Well, it depends on how many there are in the plural. I mean, I would say if there's more than a dozen of them, you know, it might be a conspiracy of Moriartys.
That's pretty good. I like it. What would you call a group of Sherlockians?
I think an induction of Sherlockians.
An induction of Sherlockians, a gaggle. A murder?
No,
I think Mike Whalen years ago said we are an eccentricity of Sherlockians.
Well, that's pretty good. But no, if a gaggle would be a group of vaudevillians.
Well, let's keep gaggling on here so we don't ruin the show. So when we think of Professor Moriarty, we think of him as the standalone, this figure that visited Sherlock Holmes in The Final Problem. Of course, that thin, ascetic figure, the reptilian shake of the head back and forth, and the menacing conversation. And by the way, one of the most brilliant conversations anywhere on the printed page. You think Sherlock Holmes's mind-reading session with Watson is impressive. Well, you recall, of course, Moriarty and Holmes basically presupposed what each other were saying, and the conversation was essentially done. You know, all that I'm saying crossed your mind? Yes, well then possibly my answer has crossed yours. That's it, you know? Brilliant, brilliant minds. But if you scratch the surface a little bit, you find that there is not one, but two, perhaps even three Moriartys hence the title of this episode. It's bad enough that we have to deal with the three Gables, the three students, the three Garridebs, the three professors from a couple of episodes ago. Now we're dealing with three Moriartys. Where do we come across any of these other Moriartys, Bert?
Well, there are at least two referenced in the canon, but there's a third that comes from Sherlockian scholarship, and one of the great nexus, the great coordination points for all of this is Vincent Starrett. Vincent Starrett suggested in an essay that I think is in 221B, Studies in Sherlock Holmes, that Professor James Moriarty had two brothers, and each was named James. And the way he did this was sort of by recounting the canon. And so Starrett wrote, there's considerable mystery around this whole business of the brothers. In the Valley of Fear, we are told by Holmes that the professor's brother was a station master in the west of England. Yet, in the final problem, he's a colonel. Now, he may have been both, to be sure, but somehow it seems unlikely. And then Starrett says, is it not even possible that there was a third brother whose name perhaps also was James? And that sort of tees up the problem that people have been speculating happily on for decades.
Interesting. Well, the first we ever hear of a Moriarty, and we have to go by publication date, not by chronology, because, the difference here when we're talking about the two stories that Moriarty's name appears in, you've got The Final Problem, which appeared in the memoirs of Sherlock Holmes, and then you've got The Valley of Fear, which happened, oh goodness, was that before or after his last bow? I'm thinking about it. It was before his last bow. It was after The Return. But chronologists have dated The Valley of Fear as happening before The Final Problem. Obviously, because you wouldn't really have a run-in with Moriarty if he had gone over the Reichenbach Falls. So, let's talk about the publication appearances of Moriarty. The first time he appears is The Final Problem. And in the very opening paragraph, Watson, he starts out with that iconic, it's with a heavy heart that I take up my pen to write these, the last words, which I shall ever record, the singular gifts by which my friend Mr. Sherlock Holmes was distinguished. Phew, that's quite a sentence. But he said, he wanted to give some account of the strange experiences that brought them together, but he said, it was my intention to have stopped after the naval treaty, and to have nothing of that, to have said nothing of that event which has created a void in my life, which the lapse of 2 years has done little to fill. My hand has been forced, however, by the recent letters in which Colonel James Moriarty defends the memory of his brother, and I have no choice but to lay the facts before the public exactly as they occurred. Now, the side note here is that we get Colonel James Moriarty, the brother. Professor Moriarty's first name, his Christian name, was never mentioned in this story. He was just Professor Moriarty. And Martin Dakin, he doubts that James was the professor's first name, because we learned the professor's first name in The Empty House when Holmes came back and explained exactly what happened. But Dakin says this is a slip of Watson's. Given that it's a slip of Watson's, could his first name actually be John? And then Dakin further notes that William Gillette in his apocryphal play on Sherlock Holmes gives Moriarty the name of Robert. It's not known what authority he had for this, and it may have been no more than his attempt to solve the well-known difficulty. And interestingly, I recall the wrap-up scene in, I believe, Silver Blaze, starring Arthur Wantner, in which Moriarty makes an appearance. And they say, I arrest you, Robert Moriarty. So they picked up on the Gillette influence. This would, of course, been coming off of the decades of notoriety of the Gillette play in the early 1930s, and just using that as Professor Moriarty's given name at that time. So, interesting aside.
Yes. Well, also, I think somewhere Vincent Starrett referred to the professor as Robert, but you're right in looking at the publication dates for all of these things. I mean, bear in mind that the Gillette play took place. The Gillette play was on the stage, published a success in 1899, and toured through 1903, 4, 5 in England, and was revived after that. But the point there is, the Gillette play comes to light when there is no identified first name in the canon. The Valley of Fear isn't published until 1915, although, of course, it is, as you mentioned, generally thought to be in the late 1880s in terms of the chronologists. But that doesn't help us because it wasn't published. So the Gillette play gives the professor the name Robert, and that did seem to have some little influence. And I think somewhere, maybe it was an appointment of Baker's. No, an appointment of Baker Street was.
That was years later.
But that was Edgar Smith. That wasn't
right.
Vincent Starrett.
That wasn't Starrett. But we did find out that Moriarty's name was James in The Empty House, which of course came in 1903. 03.
No, 1903.
Yeah. 03, right.
October 1903.
That's right. It was 10 years after. So that would have post-dated the Gillette play, but predated the Valley of Fear. So that gets us the two brothers Moriarty. And, what's interesting to me is we learn just enough about Professor Moriarty in The Final Problem to give him a little bit of life, but it isn't until we get to the Valley of Fear that you really begin to see the character become more well-rounded and to go from this, arch-rival caricature to a more fully realized arch-villain. The description of his publication, we go from just from the binomial theorem to the publication of Dynamics of an Asteroid, which is fascinating. We get his interest in art and his interest in stolen art, we should say, and the Greuze painting, the Jean-Baptiste Greuze that he had. So we find ourselves, by the time we get to the Valley of Fear, of having Moriarty very much on the mind. And for him to make an appearance in this backward-looking story, a story looking at a case of Holmes in the past, really shouldn't be too much of a surprise to anyone who has followed Sherlock Holmes for any degree. So.
Oh, no, not at all. Not at all. And also, Moriarty looms so large that the idea of more than one James Moriarty is just profoundly attractive to people and generates a lot of speculation that I'm sure we can get into in just a little while.
We say the Baker Street Journal is an irregular quarterly of Sherlockiana, but the fact is you can count on the Baker Street Journal to arrive in your mailbox if you're a regular subscriber 5 times a year. That's once a quarter, plus the Christmas annual. And each time it arrives, it has a regular array of features, such as the editor's gas lamp, Art in the Blood, the Commonplace Book, Baker Street Inventory, and more. And of course, peppered throughout are insightful articles and scholarship that make the world of Sherlock Holmes come alive to people around the world as they try their hand at finding out deeper details about some of the minutiae in the stories or about Victorian life. If you don't yet, please consider a subscription to the Baker Street Journal. Go to BakerStreetIrregulars.com and make sure you get your regular delivery of the journal today. Well, we are back. We are speculating all about the brothers Three Moriarty. Incidentally, Bert, It's interesting to note that along the way, was it John Bennett Shaw, the driving force behind one of the societies that was actually called the Brothers Three of Moriarty?
Oh, yes, sure, absolutely. The Brothers Three of Moriarty was John's one of his many pet projects, and a wonderful group. And didn't it meet in Moriarty at least once in Moriarty, New Mexico, or something?
It did. They would have a "You Bastard Moriarty" birthday celebration every year. They go out and they'd shoot some tin cans or a sign or something like that. And I think in one of the Baker Street Journal Christmas annuals, was it Sonia Featherston that made a trip out to Albuquerque and went to some of the old haunts that
right.
John Bennett Shaw went to? And there was a Moriarty's pub or something like that, maybe. A little fuzzy there. But we aren't here to talk about pubs or towns or Sherlockians. We're here to talk about the Moriarty brothers. So we talked about the Colonel who complained by post to John H. Watson to kind of clear his brother's name. Fat lot of good that did. We obviously heard from Watson about the professor himself, whom we later learned was also named James, just like the Colonel who wrote to him. But here in the Valley of Fear, in passing, we hear of another Moriarty brother. In this case, it was the youngest brother, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, younger, yeah.
Yeah. Said, you've seen the point of the picture. It shows him to be a very wealthy man. They're talking about the art collection of James Moriarty. How did he acquire wealth? He's unmarried. His younger brother is a station master in the west of England. His share is worth $700 a year, and he owns a cruise. So that's that passing mention that we have right there in the Valley of Fear of the station master brother is the only hint.
Yes. Now, some people have speculated over the years that, okay, look, first of all, this is the younger brother, not the youngest brother. And second of all, why could the station master not be also a colonel, a former colonel? And I suppose it's perfectly possible. But Starrett, it suggested that there were two brothers and each was named James. Well, Walter Jaffe had a good deal of fun in the summer 2007 Baker Street Journal suggesting that perhaps the Moriarty parents gave all their children the same name and there were three brothers rather than two. And the reason for this, he says, is that, well, we know that Moriarty had criminal tendencies. A criminal strain ran in his blood. As Holmes said, I think, which instead of being modified was increased and rendered infinitely more dangerous by his extraordinary mental powers. So, says Walter Jaffe, it follows that his parents would have had those same diabolical and nefarious tendencies. And in fact, that lineage probably ran back several generations. So if the parents were perpetuating the genetic family history, why not think of how wonderful it would be to be able to confuse the authorities, to confuse Scotland Yard by having three brothers in entering lives of crime, all named James? How could you place James Moriarty at the scene of a crime when a dozen eyewitnesses would swear he was enjoying a concert 20 miles away? And maybe, says Walter Jaffe, maybe they were identical triplets. Now that, of course, you could still be a younger brother. I mean, somebody has to be a minute or two earlier.
Yeah. That's an interesting theory. And, what do you think the parents would have been doing? Because look, they raised a son who was extremely gifted mathematically, academically. They raised another one who was obviously successful enough to attain the rank of colonel in the military. You could speculate that, well, perhaps as, was the custom back then, they bought the commission in the army, which came with that title. They had the ability to properly educate the middle James. And so by the time they got to the youngest son, perhaps they were all out of funds. And it just makes me wonder what the Moriarty parents did. Were they used handsome cab salespeople? What was their tendency that they were concerned about and that earned them enough money to be able to take care of at least their first two sons in this manner?
Well, I like that theory very much too. I mean, there's been far too little, if any, speculation about the parents of James Moriarty. I think that's a gap that really needs to be filled. Mom and Dad Moriarty. Can you imagine what birthdays in the Moriarty house must have been? How would they possibly call their children? If I had three children all with the same name, one would be James, one would be Giovanni, one would be, say, what's Latin for
you just call him Jimmy.
Okay. Jimmy, Giovanni,
James.
Hamish. There you go.
Yeah, although that would have been crossing streams from the Irish Moriarty to the Scottish Hamish. But maybe this is one for our fans to investigate. What do you say, friends? You feel like you have a paper in you? Maybe the Baker Street Journal wants to hear about the parents' Moriarty. We'll see. But in the meantime, I think we've explored the three James Moriartys just about as much as we can, even though they were a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
You evidently don't know me.
On the contrary, I think it's fairly evident that I do. I can spare you 5 minutes, if you have anything to say.